Hey there, fellow classic comic collectors. As always, I'm Scott Harris King, coming to you live from my couch. And today I am going to be doing the first part of my 500 subscriber Ask Me Anything. So I've settled in to get comfortable. As I mentioned in the announcement video where I announced the winner of the contest, I have so many questions this time that I'm going to break it up into like 30-minute chunks because, as you know, I can really ramble when I get going. So I'm going to go through these in the order that I received the questions. I should say that I have not spent any time looking at these questions or thinking about them. So some of them I know are quite complex and require deep thinking. I haven't done any of that deep thinking. I'm going to be answering these off the top of the dome. So we're going to jump right in and we're going to see what your questions are and what my answers are. All right, so the first question comes from MRP, and MRP says, "What is your favorite single issue or run by George Perez?" Of course, I was giving away a George Perez signed copy of Justice League of America 200, and my favorite single issue or run by George Perez. I'm a big Avengers fan. I have other stuff from Perez that I like as well, like his Wonder Woman run, etc. But I would have to say it's probably Avengers. I'm a big fan of uh, the Korvac saga. Um, but I think just before that, he did the two-parter with Ultron in 161 and 162, where Ultron seems to kill the whole team and a group of Avengers gathers together to try and rescue Wasp. That's probably my pick. So thanks for the question, MRP. Okay, Las Cruces 1971 says, "Have you ever collected, or what do I think about people who buy books due to subject matter on the cover, like buying comic books with Infinity, Robot, Monster, Bondage, etc. covers?" It's a great question. Actually, MRP I know has a collection where he collects comics where there's a woman wearing a red dress on the cover, which is cool. And I've seen collections like this before. There's a guy who had a collection on the CGC forums for many years, which was his Lady in White collection, which is women wearing white dresses or wedding dresses, usually on like gothic horror covers, like running away from like a creepy mansion, that sort of thing. I've seen people that have they collect covers with people in parachutes, collect covers of people underwater. I think it's really cool. It's not how I tend to collect. I've thought about it doing something like this a couple times because there are certain I do like robot covers, for instance, but it depends on the robot. I don't know. I tend to collect for runs and I collect for stories, so it just doesn't really suit my collecting style. I just have a hard time with that type of focus. But I think it's really neat, and I love seeing when people have put together runs like that. So thanks, Las Cruces, for the question. I appreciate it. Okay, next question comes from hello, how are you? Which I believe used to be K Titus. Thanks very much. I always appreciate your support. Usually, hello is the first person who gets to see my videos because in Japan it's daytime when they get published. Let's see. What would you say is your most wanted book and your most prized book? Thanks very much for the question. Great question. My most prized book is the easier one to answer. It's my Avengers #1 that is signed by Stan Lee that my parents gave to me for my 14th birthday. And there's a bunch of other stuff involved with that issue as well. It's just has a lot of history for me. So my Avengers #1 is definitely my most prized book. I have 4 or 5 others that are in that same, that are very close. The Boy Comics 3 that my wife gave me for my birthday with the first appearance of Crime Buster. My Avengers #4 is right up there. Gru #1 that my dad and I used to read together is up there. And those are some of my top books. But Avengers 1 is my most prized. What is my most wanted book? Now that's a much more difficult question. I find that I have a lot of the books that I really want, and there's a number of I would say I have most of my Grail books. Like, there's a lot of books I would really like to have. I've almost put together a complete run of Thor a couple times. Last time I got within 4 issues, and I just didn't think I would ever be able to get a Journey to Mystery 83, so I ended up selling almost the entire run. I only have a couple issues left from it. So Journey to Mystery 83 is one that I've always really wanted. In terms of the early Marvels, that's probably the one that I'd want the most. Fantastic Four #1 would be cool, but I don't really collect Fantastic Four. So Journey to Mystery 83 would be a big one, and All-Star #8, I guess, is the real answer. That's what I'm doing. The trading challenge is for the All-Star 8 with the first Wonder Woman, but again, I don't know if I'll ever be able to get to that. Captain America Comics #1 would be a big one. Archie #1, Pep 22. There's a lot of big books that I would really love to get, but some of them are so big that I would feel weird about owning them. I'm not sure if I had a Captain America Comics #1, I wouldn't feel comfortable having it in the house, and it just feels like it defeats the purpose if it's in like a safety deposit box, and it's worth so much money that I think I'd feel compelled to sell it to help like buy a house or something. So those sort of considerations come in there. But I guess All-Star Comics #8, because if I get a really low grade like restored copy, still going to be 5 figures, but it'll be, it might not be absolutely insane. But anyway, that's probably the answer. So thanks very much for the question. I appreciate it. Dratchier's Comics and Things. Hello, Richard. Thanks very much, and I appreciate you commenting here and your support. I've mentioned this before, but it was in response to Dratchier's top 50 books 2 years ago that I made mine and started the channel. So, what is something about the modern age of comics that you like or wish existed in previous age of comics? Let me read that again because I might have messed that up. Well, what is something about the modern age of comics that you like or wish existed in the previous ages of comics? This could be something as simple: paper quality, complex as storytelling strategies. Okay. Basically, the distribution. I've talked a lot about this as a self-published creator. The ability to bypass the traditional distribution systems to go directly to readers has allowed, it's basically removed the gatekeeping from comics, that in addition to the print on demand. So that allows anybody to make comics. And so there's a lot of like, if this has been something that had been around in the 40s and 50s, who knows what we could have seen, because, only the big companies were really able to put out the books. And when other people tried to put out books, a lot of times they went out of business because they didn't have the distribution. They couldn't get the comics to people. And so, we don't start to see underground comics until the 60s and into the 70s, because there starts to be a distribution system at like head shops and stuff. And then of course we have, when the comic shops start in the late 70s, we get the huge indie boom in the early 80s, because now independent people can get stuff out via the direct market. But now we have the online stuff. So if we had in the golden age the kind of excessive like ease of printing and distribution that we have now, it would be fantastic to see what people at that time, all the different voices that we would have had that we didn't get because you had to go through the publishers. So who knows what we would have seen if Simon and Schuster had been able to keep the rights to Superman and self-publish it. Would it have been as big? I don't know. Would we have gotten the superheroes? I don't know. But it would have been interesting to see if some of those titles were published by like the equivalent of an Image Comics or something at that time. So anyway, that's my thoughts. So thanks very much for the question. I really appreciate it. Okay, next question, Caleb A. Here's my Golden Age related question. How come the religious genre is ignored or not valued as much? Occasionally there's some beautiful cover art, but is it a taboo genre? I don't think it's really taboo per se. I don't think that's it. But I mean, in general, well, I've got a couple different thoughts on this. Of course, in general, superhero comics are the most expensive. The subject matter does matter to collectors, even to people who aren't really reading the books, you know. So you get the subgenres, like the horror stuff is popular with the horror people. The romance stuff is popular because of the, you know, the artwork, but also the melodrama, you know. Religious comics, the stories tend to be more, you know, either stuff from the Bible or kind of stuff with a moral, like literally preachy stuff. I don't think that appeals to a lot of people. One of the big things I think is that when you say it's a taboo genre, I think it's actually sort of the other way around. I think in certain religious circles, and I know this firsthand from growing up in a religious environment where I went to private religious schools. There's a taboo against reading comics and collecting comics. At least there used to be in my younger days. So I feel like, and I think a lot of that's still carry over from the comic scares of the 50s. There's this idea that these stories are corrupting and stuff like that. So when I was growing up, at least, that was definitely still there in the religious communities. So I think that the people who would be the natural audience to collect the religious comics are people who are discouraged from getting into comics. Now, there's some great cover art. You know, some of the treasure chests have some great art. I have a small collection of like religious stuff. I'm trying to put together a collection of all the Spire books on the cheap, and I pick up things if I see some odd religious books because it's a particular area of interest to me, given my religious background. But that's my best guess, is that it's just the people that would be buying them are people that have been discouraged from getting into comics to begin with. There's definitely some interesting stuff out there, though. So thanks very much for the question, Caleb. I appreciate it. Justin Bolka asks, you're a big romance collector. As a newer follower, I've wondered if you could explain your fascination with the genre. Sure, I can talk about that. I have talked about it in the past, but you know, I'm not expecting everyone to go back and watch all the hundreds of videos I've made. So there's a few different things that sort of led me to it. When I was growing up as a kid, you know, I was part of what I guess they call the latchkey generation, where we sort of left to our own devices. But when I was really young, because my parents were both working, I would come home from school and I would stay with my grandparents between school ending and my parents getting out of work. So there'd be a couple hours every day I'd spend at my grandparents' house, and then during the summer I'd be at my grandparents' all the time. And my grandmother she had arthritis, she couldn't really walk, so she was confined to a chair. So she would just sit there and watch soap operas all day. So for many years growing up, every day is soap operas. And so that sort of gave me an appreciation for the soap opera type of genre. Those are my favorite romance comics, are the ongoing soap opera serials. There's a few of them. Those are the ones that are like the best. I am also romantic, but in addition to that, there's some great artwork, some great artists that worked on a lot of these books. You know, particularly in the 50s and the 60s, really, to me, or 60s DC. You've got John Romita, you've got Gene Colan, you've got J. Scott Pike. In the 50s, Atlas had a great lineup of artists. You get Vince Colletta, you get, again, J. Scott Pike was working at Atlas at the time. Al Hartley's stuff before he started doing the cartoonier things is actually really good. You know, Matt Baker, Nick Cardy does a lot of romance books in the late 60s and into the 70s. So there's just a lot of really top artists doing some great work drawing attractive women. And then there's the stories, which, I know I always say with the romance comics, when the stories are good, they're really good. And when they're bad, they're fantastic, because there's other than some formulaic stuff that happens in the DC books in particular, there's you don't get like boring romance stories that often. You're usually either legitimately good or they're just like crazy, like cringy, melodramatic, ridiculous, offensive. So they're almost always fun to read. Of course, you want to read them in short batches because there are formulas, particularly DC and to a lesser extent Charlton. But yeah, it's just they're just fun to read. So thanks very much for the question. I really appreciate it. Gary B, the casual comic guy. My question would be, what storyline made the biggest impression on you, and do you revisit it? Good question. I've got a couple answers. In general, the storylines that came out when I was a kid have the biggest impression on me. Talked about this before, where growing up in the 80s, I actually early on came into a large collection of 70s books. So I was really much more into the Bronze Age books than I was the current books coming out. So like I prefer Bronze Age to Copper Age. I prefer the 70s to the 80s in terms of buying and reading and collecting comics, even though I grew up in the 80s. I don't really have that kind of nostalgia for the 80s. However, I will say that there was some of the storylines that came out in those first couple years when I was reading comics really had a big impression and huge impact in me becoming such a big comics fan. I started reading Warlord towards the end of the big Shambhala storyline where the city had been conquered in issue 75, I think it was, and they didn't get it back to 100, so there was this huge storyline where they were leading this resistance army. I started right as they were getting towards the end of that with issue 90, so I remember that, but because that was right when I first started comics. And then at the same time, my first Marvel comic was Thor 350, I think. It might have been 351. So we get Walt Simonson's Surtur Saga take place at the same time. So those are two storylines I was reading simultaneously that got me into comics. I would say the two storylines, though, that really had the biggest impression is the Under Siege storyline by Roger Stern and John Buscema, Avengers 271 to 277. Avengers was my favorite superhero book at the time, and that sort of cemented it. And I just remember being on the edge of my seat, waiting that month to get the next issue to find out what was happening. It was just it was great. It was fantastic. The other one is ElfQuest. So I started reading ElfQuest in 1985 with the first issue of the Epic reprint, the color reprints. And somewhere around issue 6 or 7, I realized that these were reprints and that you could get the whole series in collected editions, the Starblaze editions. So I got volumes 2, 3, and 4 and read the whole rest of the run, the whole story, because that was also colorized. And that storyline is it's great. It's great. Huge impact on me. So those are, I can't really pick between them, but do I revisit it? It's been a while since I've read any of those comics that I just talked about, but yes, occasionally. I mean, I've read the Under Siege storyline probably, 9 or 10 times over the years. ElfQuest less frequently, but I've read that a few times as well. It's been quite a while since I've gone back and read either of them at this point, though, so I should do that at some point. Okay, Silver Knight Kyle. Hi, Kyle. Thanks very much, as always, for supporting. I really appreciate it. Let's see. Looking for the question. Here we go. Is there a character, maybe soon, coming into the public domain that you have high hopes of intertwining into future self-publishings? That's a really good question. The short answer is no. So that's the short answer. The longer answer is it gets tricky because there are characters that are currently in the public domain that could fit into some of my stories or be interesting to use, but because of the trademarks and these companies with the ridiculous litigation, some of them it's just too dangerous to even try and use them. Zorro is a big one where he's definitely in the public domain, but there's a company that will sue anybody that even thinks about using Zorro in any capacity. Um, and it gets kind of silly. There's these like absolutely unfounded like lawsuits from people that claim they own various rights to different like Sherlock Holmes stories, for instance. So it's always a little bit dodgy. I think this is a good question. 5 or 6 years from now, I might have a different answer. When we start getting into the 1930s, we're looking at a huge batch of not just superheroes coming into the public domain, but which will be a little more than a decade from now, when we really start getting all the superheroes coming in the public domain. But you start getting all these pulp characters like Conan and like we get characters of the Phantom and the Shadow, and all these different characters are going to be popping into the public domain sometime in the next like 12 years or so. So I don't know where I'll be in my creative journey at that point. But right now, I can't think of anyone right now that I want to use that isn't already in the public domain. Um, but it's something that I basically evaluate year to year. So we'll see how it goes. I think 10 years from now it's going to be a completely different conversation. We don't even know what's going to be happening in comics in 10 years, but when we get to the point where some of the big characters start appearing in the public domain, I think we're going to see a huge boom in. We're already getting this boom in the golden age superhero public domain comics, like I do, and a number of other people have been doing the last couple of years that I've talked about before. But that's going to be exponential when when Superman pops into the public domain, in whatever it is, 12 years or something. I think it's gonna be crazy how many comics you're going to be seeing with some version of Superman or Batman or whatever, and there's going to be so many of them. So we'll see. I'm really curious to see what happens. Thanks very much for the question, Kyle. I appreciate it. Next question comes from the Gray Man. I can't remember if you ever heard how you got into comics in the first place. Which comics on the newsstand made you want to read them? Great question. I have talked about this some, and it gets a little bit dicey because I was familiar with the genre of comics before I saw comic books. So I know that I was definitely reading comic strips, stuff like Garfield. I would read the comics, Sunday comics. I was familiar with comics from like Mad Magazine as well. I would read Mad Magazine. I definitely had some mini comics like Atari Force that would come with the Atari cartridges. So I was familiar with comics from that. But I hadn't seen any comic books. For whatever reason, I don't remember seeing any. I know at some point I read some Archie somewhere too, but I don't know when that was. But 1984, when I was 10 years old, my parents joined a bowling league, and it was this thing where while they were, I had to go with them, but couldn't actually bowl with them because it was an adult league. So I'd basically be sitting there for 2 hours doing nothing. So to keep me entertained, they give me a little bit of money. I could play video games, whatever. But I would take some of the money, and there was a convenience store or drugstore or something in the plaza with the bowling alley. They had paperback novels, remaindered with the covers torn off, which they weren't supposed to be selling, but they were. And those were 50 cents each or whatever. But they also had a spinner rack with comics. And so when I first got into it, what I was into was genre stuff. It wasn't into the superhero stuff. All the first comics that I got were war comics, fantasy comics, sci-fi comics, and a lot of them were tie-ins. So I was buying a lot of stuff like ROM, Micronauts, Transformers. I was buying Star Wars. I was buying Conan. I was buying Red Sonja. I was buying mostly GI Joe, like mostly licensed books. Warlord was an early one that wasn't licensed. But the first comic I bought was actually Blackhawk. It's Blackhawk 269. I think I got 269 and 270 at the same time. 269 has this fantastic cover of of death, like holding the earth, with a bunch of like swastikas and stuff. So it's just a great cover, and that really drew me in. So but yeah, I think I had been primed for the form, and I became an instant comic collector. I went home with those two issues of Blackhawk. I made a checklist. It didn't occur to me you could get back issues, so I started with 269 and I wrote it out up to 300, and I crossed off 269, 270, put them in the folder, and I never saw another issue. The series was canceled with 273. I never saw. I think we didn't go back to bowling for a while, so this would have been in the beginning of the year in '84, and then I don't think we went back until the summer, and Blackhawk had been canceled. So by the time I got back there and back to seeing more comics, it was several months later, and that's when I started reading Warlord and Thor and Conan and stuff. But Blackhawk is the one, and it just immediate collector. Like literally, as soon as I bought them, I made my first checklist, started collecting. So thanks very much for the question, Gray Man. I appreciate it very much. Okay, we got Metarog here. What's your dream creative team, characters, and stories, regardless of era? Thanks very much for the question. This is something I've actually answered on my podcast, because when I have podcast guests, I have a questionnaire, and I ask them this, like, if you could have one dream book, any creative team, character, whatever, what would it be? And of course, I've had to answer it myself. And so, as you guys know, I'm a big fan of Crime Buster. Actually, I'm wearing my Crime Buster shirt that I made, that says busting crime since 1942, and to the point where when I realized it was public domain, I decided to just make my own continuation of the series, starting with issue 120. So what I would really like is a Crime Buster comic. And the creative team that I would want would be Darwin Cook on pencils, and probably there's a lot of different writers, but I would probably say Ed Brubaker. So that would be the team I'd want. I want a Crime Buster comic, set in the 50s, with Ed Brubaker writing, Darwin Cook on pencils. That would be my dream book. Of course, that's never going to happen, but that's what I would really like. So, thanks for the question, Roger. I appreciate it. I appreciate all the support, of course, as well. And I think last question for this first round, Main Event Comics. Thanks very much for joining, new sub. I really appreciate it. A Green Lantern ring and Mjolnir have crossed into another universe. Which comic book universe are they in? They can be in different ones. And which non-powered characters are wielding them? Great question. Okay. All right, well, I'm going to put them in different universes. I think the obvious answer for Green Lantern is which non-powered characters. Well, that just kind of took away my answer, but I'm going to say it anyway. I think the obvious answer for Green Lantern would be Matt Murdock, Daredevil, because it's the same basic. The thing with the Green Lantern ring is, it searches. I don't know what it is now. It searches for someone without fear, basically. So I think it's obvious that Matt Murdock, the man without fear, would be a person to get it. Maybe that's a cop out because he does have powers, but that would be my pick, which would be odd. I don't know. You use your willpower to create these constructions. I don't know how that would work since Matt Murdock's blind, because it's such a visual I don't know. Mjolnir. We're putting Mjolnir in the Archie comics universe, and it's going to be Betty that's wielding it. It's kind of ill-defined what it means to be worthy of the power of Thor. But in terms of being pure of heart, even though Archie's character, superhero identity, is actually called Pure Heart, but in terms of being pure of heart and character, I think Betty is the most sort of pure-hearted character that sort of pops into mind right away. So I would say that Betty would be worthy of lifting Mjolnir, and that's who I would be giving it to. Thanks very much for the question. Sorry if the Green Lantern answer was kind of crappy, but that's where I'm going with that. And it would be, I would dislike Matt Murdock in a lot of the same ways that I dislike Hal Jordan. So that would be perfect. So anyway, thanks for that question. That's it for this time. Next time around, we got a whole nother batch of questions. We still have tons of questions to get through. So thanks very much for watching. And if you haven't seen your question yet, don't worry. It's coming up next time around. Thanks.